Alright guys, so as of this morning, both Israel and Hamas have officially signed off on at least phase 1 of a ceasefire deal that could potentially lead to the end of the genocide in Gaza. Now, a couple of notes here before we get to the actual nuts and bolts of what's in this ceasefire deal, as well as potentially the likelihood of Israel blowing this up as they have with previous ceasefire agreements. I want to show you guys what Israel has been doing in the run-up to when this was supposed to take effect. So here from Prem, as is very typical in ceasefire agreements, both in Gaza as well as Lebanon, as well as Iran, Israel is ramping up their attacks right before the buzzer. So this is hours after Israel agreed to a ceasefire. They say here from Gaza notifications that the Israeli army intensified its attacks across various areas of Gaza City, blowing up residential homes and remotely detonating booby-trapped armored vehicles. We also have video here of IDF tanks stationed along Al Rashid Street firing shells directly towards civilians waiting to return to their homes in Gaza City. So again, this is nothing new. This is what they have always done in the run-up to these kinds of ceasefires, is they drastically escalate their attacks, trying to get as much death and destruction as possible in the final minute before the ceasefire takes place. Now, this is out of date. This is from a couple of days ago, back when Donald Trump was telling Israel to stop the bombing after he announced the outline of the initial ceasefire agreement. And it seems like there have been changes to the initial one that was announced by Trump and Bibi, and we'll break all of that down. But even since Trump announced that he wanted them to stop bombing, which was back on, I believe, October 4th, Israel, just in the 2 days after that, killed over 104 people. Now, we're on October 9th at this point, so it could be into the hundreds that Israel has killed in Gaza since this ceasefire was originally announced. Now, we also have video here, heartbreaking but uplifting at the same time, coming out of Gaza, of children, Palestinians in Gaza jumping with joy as parents chant Hudna, 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 which is an Arabic word meaning a long-term truce or a ceasefire. And obviously, regardless of, how kind of terrible of a deal this may look in the broad scopes way, for Palestinians in the long term, obviously there has been so much death, so much destruction, so much suffering, so much torture that Palestinians have gone through for over 2 years, but really the last 2 years of this genocide, that, it seems like any reprieve from that suffering is a positive thing, at least in the short term. So now to get to what's actually in this deal and what the likelihood is of this being a success of any sort. So here from Dropsite News, Jeremy Scahill, his headline is Hamas and Palestinian factions agree to Gaza ceasefire, and Trump confirms that the deal was reached. So a bunch of different details from this that I think are important. They say Hamas and other Palestinian factions agreed to a framework for the Gaza ceasefire deal on Wednesday evening. A senior Hamas official and a second source close to the Palestinian negotiating team told Dropsite. They say, from our side, yes, the Palestinians reached an agreement, the Hamas official said, but added that they needed to finalize some points with the mediators, saying it's over, it's been decided, according to the second source. Everyone's agreed on it. There are a few things that will be discussed, but it's over. They say mediators, the source close to the negotiators said, told the Palestinian side that Donald Trump planned to personally announce a permanent ceasefire and had offered assurances that the U.S. would not permit Israel to resume the war after retrieving Israeli captives, which is obviously what pretty much all of this is going to come down to at the end of the day. Whether or not they do this initial hostage swap, Palestinians are released from Israeli captivity, and Hamas gives back the remaining hostages that they have to Israel. Will Donald Trump then restrain Israel and prevent them from just ramping back up the genocide after Hamas gives up what is really their only point of leverage at this point, the remaining hostages alive and dead still inside of Gaza? So this is a huge point of trust, essentially, that Hamas and the other Palestinian resistance factions are placing in Donald Trump to actually carry this out on this assurance. Now, they continue. They say 37 minutes after the story was published, Trump announced that a deal had been reached, saying, quote, I am very proud to announce that Israel and Hamas have both signed off on the first phase of our peace plan. This means that all of the hostages will be released very soon, and Israel will withdraw their troops to an agreed-upon line as the very first steps forward to a strong, durable, and everlasting peace. All parties will be treated fairly, and he says this is a great day for the Arab and Muslim world, Israel, all surrounding nations, and the United States of America. Now, again, another key point here. He says that the hostages will be released, and Israel will withdraw their troops to an agreed upon line, that line still being inside of Gaza. And it appears like it's pretty close to the original map that I showed you guys in my first breakdown of this deal about 8 days ago on this channel. So they're still going to remain occupying Gaza for the foreseeable future. They say Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made a post referring to the Israeli captives held in Gaza, saying, "With God's help, we will bring them all home." And in a subsequent post, he said, "Tomorrow I will convene the government to approve the agreement and bring all of our dear hostages home." Now, as of this point, right now that I'm making this video, it doesn't seem like the cabinet has officially approved of this, but it does seem like they're on track to approve of this deal, and then it will officially be put in place. Now, they continue here saying that Qatar, along with Egypt, has been the main mediator in the ceasefire negotiations. They say, quote, "An agreement was reached on all the previous and implementation provisions and implementations mechanisms of the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire agreement, which will lead to ending the war, the release of the Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners, as well as the entry of aid." They say multiple sources from Hamas and other Palestinian factions told Dropsite that their central concern in these negotiations was that handing over all Israeli captives would remove all of their leverage if it did not include a complete Israeli withdrawal, which is true. They say Israel has, as a matter of policy, systematically violated its ceasefire agreements with Hamas and also with Lebanon, who they're still bombing right now, even though they're supposed to be in a ceasefire agreement. And in entering into these negotiations, Hamas negotiators accepted that they were engaging in a high-stakes gamble, saying, "This is the risk, but we trusted President Trump to be the guarantor of all of the commitments made," according to a senior Hamas leader. He says, "Had there been no commitment from the American president, we would never have agreed to take the risk because we don't trust Netanyahu or his extremist right-wing team in the current Israeli government." So again, they're putting a lot of trust and faith here that Donald Trump is going to keep his word. Now, if there's one thing that I know about Donald Trump, it's that he's probably, behind Netanyahu, the single least trustworthy leader on the face of the planet, right? So, and you know, to be fair, it's not like there's anybody else that they could put their faith in this kind of a situation. Trump is the, you know, lesser of two evils, I guess, between himself and Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, you can also tangentially make the case that Donald Trump may actually want the Israelis to wrap this up, and he doesn't want it to drag on for a number of different reasons. Number one being that he sort of sees dollar signs in the future of Gaza. We've seen his Gaza Riviera fantasy, the AI generation that he made a few months back of, you know, high rises and Trump hotels and whatever on the coast of Gaza. And he has deep financial ties as well with surrounding Arab states like the Saudis and the Qataris, etc. So there's that angle of it, that he does have a financial interest potentially in the future of what he wants Gaza to be, as well as, you know, future relationships with surrounding Arab countries that he wants to keep, you know, as good relationships. And you also have just the fact that, you know, the American people are done with this, right? Overwhelmingly, the American people do not side with Israel continuing in this genocide. And that's not just, you know, the left or independents or whatever, but it's also a huge chunk of his own base that has fully turned against Israel at this point. So, you know, there are a number of reasons to potentially be hopeful that Donald Trump does genuinely want this to wrap up, and maybe he's kind of fed up with Bibi at this point, constantly lying to him and throwing shit in his face and humiliating him over and over again. Now, on the flip side of that argument, you know, he's Donald Trump. You know, this is the guy who took over $100 million from Miriam Adelson. You know, this is a guy who is deeply embedded with the Israel lobby as much as any human being has ever been in history. So, you know, there are different competing arguments as to whether or not this trust, you know, should be highly valued or anything like that. But I guess this is kind of what they're betting on at this point. Now, they continue. They say the Palestinian negotiators, after consultations with a range of factions, agreed to a deal that will keep Israeli forces in Gaza even after all Israeli captives are handed over to Israel. And throughout the negotiations over the past several months, this was a red line, essentially, for Hamas as well as other Palestinian resistance factions. And they say while the exact lines that the Israeli forces will redeploy to as part of the exchange of captives are still being worked out, Israeli forces will remain entrenched in Gaza. And that's obviously a huge part of the concern here, is that, you know, they can pull back their lines, you know, a few kilometers or whatever the case may be, but that just means that they're still stationed there. They could resume this in a couple of days, in a couple of weeks, in a couple of months, once the world sort of turns an eye to what's going on in Gaza. So it's an extreme danger that they're facing right now. And they continue. They say the source close to the negotiations said that as part of the agreement, aid deliveries will also resume at levels consistent with the January 2025 ceasefire deal. Israel unilaterally abandoned that agreement in March when it imposed a full spectrum blockade on Gaza, causing a mass starvation, and resumed its campaign of terror bombings and subsequently unleashing a ground invasion of Gaza City back in August. The source said that 600 trucks of aid per day would enter Gaza under the agreement, which is what the United Nations says is the minimum needed for Gaza. And we've also discussed that, whatever this minimum amount of trucks worth of aid into Gaza actually is to stabilize the population for now, there are long-lasting, lifelong catastrophic health consequences for essentially a huge chunk, if not the entire population of Gaza, having gone through what, a huge chunk of the population has been through stage 5 famine at this point. So it's not just bringing some trucks of aid and some trucks of food or whatever else the case may be. You need a rush of doctors and, rebuilding of hospitals and things like that to actually truly stabilize the population for the future. But they're saying 600 trucks of aid per day. Again, that's the minimum of what's needed. And whether or not they actually allow 600 trucks per day is still up in the air, but that's part of the agreement. They say that the senior Hamas official told Dropsite that mediators assured the Palestinian side that the Rafah border crossing at the south on the Egyptian border will be reopened in both directions, saying that Rafah is the only crossing in Gaza that is going to anywhere besides Israel. And they say that Israel will release roughly 2,000 Palestinians that it is holding captive in its prisons and military camps, many of those held without any due process or charges. So essentially hostages is what we're talking about. They say the bulk of these will consist of Palestinians taken from Gaza after October 7th and will include all women and children. Now, again, it's very obvious to anybody who knows what's going on here, but sort of a tacit admission from the Israelis that, yes, we are holding hostages by the thousands, right? We have captured, even just since October 7th, but also well before that, thousands and thousands of women and children, as well as innocent men, without any sort of charge, any sort of due process, put through military courts where the prosecution is 99.9%. And we've been keeping them to do an exchange like this in the future. So again, with all of the, the uproar over the hostages held in Gaza, and I believe all of the remaining ones that are in Gaza that are going to be a part of this swap are IDF soldiers who were captured on October 7th. But, with all of the outrage about the hostages in Gaza, Israel has thousands of hostages that get absolutely no mention whatsoever from the Western press. But that's part of this deal as well. They also say that Hamas sources made it clear to Dropsite that they believe the only path to a brokered agreement to end the genocide rests with Trump. The alternative reality is an indefinite continuation of the armed struggle against a U.S.-backed Israeli military. They say, quote, there is no other deal to be taken, either this or return to fight with full American support coupled with Arab and Islamic passivity and letdown, said the source close to the negotiators. He said that while the deal is problematic, it contains some terms that Hamas and other Palestinian factions pushed for in their response to Trump, including deferring major issues that would alter the future of Gaza and Palestine itself, such as no surrender, no disarming, no mass exile, but most of all, permanent end of the war to be announced by Donald Trump. And then final thing here, they say all of these issues, including Israel's demand that Hamas and other Palestinian resistance groups surrender their weapons and Gaza be fully demilitarized, this will be deferred to future negotiations. So essentially what we have here, like the key points in the immediate future, is number one, a hostage swap on both sides. Number two, obviously a cessation of hostilities. Number three, the IDF is going to pull back to a negotiated upon line that still is within Gaza. And then finally, you have these other points of the humanitarian aid that's potentially going to flood in. And then on the contrary to that, you have sort of the, I guess, wins, if you want to call it that the Palestinian resistance groups were able to get, in that there's not going to be a mass exile from Gaza in the immediate future, and they're not going to be forced to completely demilitarized in the immediate future. Now, that's basically the outline of what we know so far. That's phase one that will take place probably over the next week or maybe couple of weeks. Hamas has said that they still need to locate some of the hostages, both alive and dead. Some of the bodies of the dead hostages that are inside of Gaza are underneath rubble because Israel bombed their locations and killed them. So that's going to be a challenge to actually locate many of the bodies of the captives that Hamas had inside of Gaza. So that'll take a minute to figure out where they are and to actually pull off the exchange of that. So all of this is going to be playing out over the next couple of days and weeks potentially. And then the big questions are like, what happens after that? Right? I mean, we already have talks here from Benjamin Netanyahu's favorite propaganda outlet in Israel, Channel 14. You had one of the hosts saying that he's hoping that after Israeli captives are back, Israel will break the deal and won't free any Palestinian hostages and resumes fighting. So these are the kinds of conversations that are already happening on Israeli mainstream media. We also had here from Bezalel Smotrich, the right-wing fascist finance minister, genocidal maniac Bezalel Smotrich, saying that there is a tremendous responsibility to ensure that this is not, God forbid, a deal of hostages in exchange for stopping the war, as Hamas thinks and boasts. So he's saying this is not going to be an end to the genocide. You know, the media is saying basically just break the deal after we get our hostages back and resume the genocide. And then, of course, we saw just a couple of days ago or just over a week ago when Netanyahu was still in the United States making the initial announcement of this deal with Donald Trump. He goes outside while he's still on U.S. soil and basically says, yeah, we have no intention of ever withdrawing from Gaza. So the big questions that remain are like, okay, well, what is the future? Let's assume that phase one goes perfectly. Then what? Right? Because the IDF is still going to be occupying Gaza. Hamas and other Palestinian resistance movements will not have demilitarized. Hamas has basically given up all of their leverage at that point. What is to stop Benjamin Netanyahu from saying, okay, well, you know, the phase two negotiations aren't really going anywhere, and or Hamas isn't demilitarizing like we want them to, so we're just going to continue and ramp up the violence. There's nothing preventing them from doing that outside of Donald Trump himself saying, no, you can't do that, right? So again, pretty much all of this hinges on Donald Trump and how he feels on that day, I guess, right, as to whether or not he will give Israel the green light to resume. And keep in mind, as a part of these conversations, while Benjamin Netanyahu was here in the United States, he did say that. He said if Hamas doesn't agree to the ceasefire, or if they violate the ceasefire in whatever way that the U.S. and the Israelis determine that Hamas has or accuse them of violating it, that he will greenlight the Israeli IDF going back into Gaza and obliterating it and doing whatever they have to do, is the words that he used. So again, the future is extremely unclear. And even in an a further ideal situation where you have positive steps in negotiations in phase two and onward, the future for Gaza that was outlined as a part of this initial agreement by Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump is an extremely bleak future. Like, we're talking about essentially a foreign colonization of Gaza, turning it into like this hyper surveilled tech dystopia where Palestinians may be able to, I guess, remain in part, but it will essentially be ruled by like Tony Blair and Larry Ellison or Donald Trump himself. So it's completely unclear, who's going to rule Gaza in the future, who will rule, in the Palestinians moving forward broadly. Is there going to be any sort of a push to a Palestinian state? Like, so many aspects of this are completely uncertain and honestly bleak, even if you account for the plan as it's laid out here. But again, there's no guarantees that we're even going to make it through phase one fully, or certainly to make it to phase two beyond the initial hostage exchange and the influx of aid and the Israeli troops withdrawing slightly and the rest of it. So one final thing, or two final things here. First, from Ryan Grimm, he says that a version of this deal has been available every day since November of 2023, when many more people were alive. And I think that this is an important point, because when you look at the key tenets of the agreement, like, Hamas has made some concessions relative to some of the previous agreements, but like, broadly, this is a deal that they have been ready and willing to accept for a long time now. I mean, you could go all the way back, as he says, to 2023, and you could have probably gotten Hamas to agree to this kind of a deal. But the Israelis weren't willing to do that. They wanted to go on a conquest, a campaign of death, destruction, obliteration of the Palestinian people. And don't get it twisted or wrong here. That still is their goal. Their goal still is to exterminate or to fully ethnically cleanse the population from Gaza. It's not as if that magically changed overnight because of this agreement, and I'm sure that they're going to be looking for any opportunity in the world to sabotage this deal or to pull out once we make it through the initial stages. But this is an important point as well. Like, all of this could have been ended with essentially a phone call, either first from Joe Biden or then subsequently by Donald Trump whenever they wanted to, and they chose not to. And I don't know what sort of snapped for Trump recently where that changed and he said, no, we actually do have to get a deal done right now. But I hope it does stick. I genuinely hope that it does stick. But if we know anything, again, about the history of how this has played out over the last couple of years, then I can't say that I'm that optimistic about it. And final thing here, just to wrap up in terms of how much has been dumped in to this genocide by the United States. We have here from DropSite, since October 7th of 2023, the U.S. has poured between $31 and $34 billion into Israel's genocide in Gaza and related military operations across the region, according to the Brown University Cost of War Project. Roughly $22 billion almost went directly in Israeli military aid, while an additional $9.6 to $12 billion was funded in U.S. operations in Yemen, Iran, and elsewhere. These figures exclude tens of billions more in pending arms deals, underscoring Washington's central role in sustaining the genocide and regional escalation. They say that more than 5.27 million people have been displaced in Gaza and the wider region, including Iran, Israel, Lebanon, the West Bank. The West Bank, they put Lebanon twice here, but all of these different places. 5.27 million people have been displaced over the last 2 years. More than 236,000 Palestinians at least have been killed or injured in Gaza alone, and some 17,000 more were killed or injured in Lebanon, and thousands more have been killed in Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria. So this is where we've been dumping our money, right? We fund Israel to bomb hospitals as our own hospitals here in the United States are closing down, right? We fund Israel to bomb schools as American teachers have to go into their own pockets in order to afford school supplies. We bomb their infrastructure while our own infrastructure is crumbling to the tune of billions, tens of billions of dollars. Not to mention the catastrophic consequences on a humanitarian front, and also not to mention the catastrophic consequences to just the concept of international law, the concept of human dignity, the concept of human rights that have been completely and totally obliterated over the last 2 years. The United States has gone to war alongside Israel with not only these countries, but with the United Nations, against the International Court of Justice, against the International Criminal Court. We have obliterated the concept of human dignity, human rights, and international law over the last 2 years of this, as well as displacing millions of people, killing hundreds of thousands, and spending tens and tens of billions of dollars that could have been spent on the American people. So I'll leave you guys off with that. Again, a lot of this ceasefire stuff is extremely tenuous. We've seen the record from Israel. We know that they can't possibly be trusted to follow this deal in accordance with how it's being laid out. They will be looking for every opportunity to blow it up. The second phase of this deal is not guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination. And yet, even with all of that, and even with how potentially horrible this deal is for Palestinians, you still get images like this. And it gives you just a little bit of hope that maybe the suffering can be, relieved, at least temporarily, or potentially even there could be a real long-term solution on the horizon. So I'll leave you guys off with that.
Politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying